So, when you're looking at Greenwich Naval College, and we're looking at it realistically in terms of its historical role, we are talking about a university, a higher institute of learning for naval command. That is realistically what it becomes. It owes its roots and its history to the Royal Naval Academy, which starts off at Portsmouth and runs from 1733 to 1837, and was supposed to provide a new method of entry for officers to give them training experience, but in practice was kind of discriminated against by the rest of the service because it couldn't produce enough officers to satisfy the service, so you had to keep the traditional apprenticeship scheme sort of system going, and that was how naval officers learned. They were apprentices. Let's be honest, you were maybe gentlemen boys or midshipmen, and then you would, study at sea, learn your trade, hopefully get taught well, pass the lieutenant's exam, and then the Navy would promote you up or use you. Basically, the first time the Navy really had contact with you was when you took your lieutenant's exam. But that didn't really work, and it wasn't really suitable to the world that was coming. One of the things you also have to remember is that the Royal Navy is, by instinct, if not by implementation, always has to be a forward-looking organisation. So it's always got to look to the future. It's always got to look to the technology which is coming, to the issues which are coming. And they realise that formal education matters. And so eventually what you get is an order in council in the 16th of January 1873, which turns the old Royal Navy Hospital into the Royal Navy College, Greenwich. And it was established with pretty much the direct role of supporting the Royal Navy in turning lieutenants into something useful. And I do want to emphasize this, it's about turning lieutenants into something useful. It's about taking officers who are already sub-lieutenants. I have managed to make it through midshipmen, become sub-lieutenants, and go, right then, so we need to make them actually capable of doing the mathematics of command, gunnery, other duties, dealing with engineering. They have to understand science, they have to understand chemistry, applied mechanics, fortification, especially for when they're in harbour, and history. History starts to come about because of various people's involvements. It's considered a methodology for teaching strategy. Show you what people have done in the past, what's worked, what hasn't worked. So you have a basis when you're looking at a scenario to go, might this be the answer? Might this not? But more importantly, so you can go, well, how did they analyse what the answer to their problem was? It has a history. The Naval University has a very great history. It was not just the Royal Navy College, which is founded in 1873, but it also is home to the Royal Navy War College for quite a while, which is an interesting organisation which I'll talk about in the next slide. It was home to the Women's Royal Naval Service Training College. It was home to the Department of Nuclear Science and Technology, which started in 1959 and included Jason, which was a research and training reactor, which was commissioned in the King William Building in 1962. Yes, there was a nuclear reactor in Greenwich. Go and look on a map and you work out, that's fairly close to central London. But it was a very low-powered reactor. It was there for training. It was there for some experience. And yes, it was useful. It was there about starting the process for naval nuclear submarine propulsion, to use that wonderful phraseology that comes out in those statements. It's all about education. It's all about preparing officers for the next generation, the future of warfare. In fact, right up until the creation of the Shrivenham Joint Staff College, or the Joint Services Commander Staff College, which in 1997, it was a critical centre for training. And in fact, the Joint Services Defence College was there from 1983. One of the interesting things is there was a point considered whether to keep Dartmouth going, Britannia Royal Naval College, as the initial training centre for young officers, or whether to keep Greenwich. Now, of course, the cost and everything favoured going to Britannia, because let's be honest, you can get more for this site than you can for Britannia, but also because you could find someone else to take over and look after this site, and the University of Greenwich was established with very, very stringent rules, which is one of the reasons why the University of Greenwich is one of the, I would argue, best run universities in the UK. Of its generation, probably is the best run university in the UK of its generation because of the rules which govern its guide its governance. One of those includes it's not allowed to get into a lot of debt. In fact, it's very limited in how much debt it can take on, which it's often complained about. Well, you're limiting its growth, but the reason is there can be no situation where it's found that someone has a claim through debt being called in to try and take ownership of this. It's kind of like royal palaces. Yes, they're used by the royal family. These are used by the University of Greenwich, their own. But they're used for them in trusts for the nation. They're not allowed to use them to cover their mortgages. It's a very cool site to go around. It's a very interesting site to go on, but it has a long history, and it becomes in many ways the point at which you can see the best examples of what the Royal Navy wants its officers to aspire to be, who they're picking as presidents. Now, I did also mention the Royal Navy War College, and that was established in 1900 by the then thinking Admiral of the Royal Navy, Rear Admiral Henry May. He's a character. He's an absolutely interesting character. But the whole point of the Royal Navy War College was that it was supposed to take people who were commanders and captains and lieutenant commanders and turn them into the training they needed to be admirals. Yes, by 1900 the Royal Navy had realised not only did they have to have an education system running, but that education system had to differentiate between the levels of command. That the skills you teach a junior officer to run a department on a ship, to be a good division officer, to take care of a small number of people, then change once you have to run a ship, then in its entirety, and then change even more when you have to run an entire fleet. The trouble is, these schools should possibly have been made mandatory, especially for certain staff officer positions, because the other thing that trains is you to be a staff officer. It does give you the training and skills you need to be a staff officer. And honestly, it should probably have been made mandatory to back it up, and certainly people like Henry May wanted that. Now, the really sad thing is this man, who is regarded as the thinking admiral, one of the smartest admirals in the Royal Navy, who had been a captain until 1902, had been in charge of this from 1900, and then is a rear admiral, promoted rear admiral whilst in a role, dies in 1904 from gastroenteritis in Greenwich. He had given a lecture in Chatham not that many years before, called The Lessons of the War of 1898, in their bearing on the influence of naval armaments as opposed to coast defence. He had done all sorts of documents, all sorts of works. This was the man who was setting up the Royal Navy's War College. And it's a really interesting part of what if history, if you think about him being a rear admiral in 1902, what rank he might have achieved by World War I. In the nicest way, it's another 12 years away. Could have served as a vice admiral, be a full admiral by then, and honestly, probably would have been. And it's an interesting officer to think about what position he'd have been in. If we consider his previous service and the service of his contemporary and friend Jellicoe, who, let's be honest, doesn't achieve Rear Admiral till much later, and is practically at this point is serving as the naval assistant to the Third Sea Lord and controller of the Navy, between 1902 and 1904. One must consider he could have gone on to very senior ranks. It's not beyond belief to think that someone of his capabilities could have been a vice admiral or a full admiral or even in a senior post in the Sea Lords by the time World War I came around. But gastroenteritis did what it did. And the Royal Navy lost a good officer who was one of many people who can probably claim to be the intellectual father of the all-big-gun battleship. Whilst Cuniberti certainly is the first and is the loudest of them all, there are others who are putting papers out which are heading along that lines, and May is certainly one of them. He's also a curious figure, in that despite being completely in the middle, in terms of his era, of the whole Fisher Beresford affair, he seems to have actually managed to be friends with both camps and respected by both camps. He's kind of a weird individual. It's a really intriguing thing, but he sets up the War College, the Royal Navy War College, and it runs till 1914 when it's stood down because we've got a massive war on. Why do we need a load of staff officers? And that shows you how much he was respected, because honestly it was his pushing for it which got it set up, with the support of both camps. And it's after the war, there is a whole discussion as to what happens to it. There are some will claim it doesn't come back into existence. It does. There are papers, there are studies from it. But it seems to be folded in staff-wise far more into the regular staff of the Greenwich Naval College, and far more a regular part of that. There are the courses going on, there are the officers going on, we do find papers, and it is regularly associated with the Third Sea Lord's office, who seems to use the papers of the Royal Navy War College as a way of predicting, or in some ways validating, what their predictions are of the future when they are trying to procure things. It's almost as if it's the, okay, I need a paper on the future of aircraft carriers that says this. Can you produce it? We have someone who's suitable. Dispatch. Scenario. And again, it functioning at Greenwich is rather useful. Greenwich is a very useful site for the Admiralty. It's very easy to communicate to. It's very easy for officers to be called up to Whitehall, to be going to the various positions they need to maintain relations in the city, etc., and in Westminster. And at the same time, it's far enough distance that they are not easily pried into what they're necessarily getting up to and how they're necessarily running. Because as we all know, getting to Greenwich from central London is actually surprisingly difficult. Surprisingly difficult. As someone who's done it a fair number of times in life, it's always surprised me going, why? Why do I have to dogleg? Why do I have to jump across a bridge? Why doesn't the train run straight? Why is this? Docklands Light Rail has improved some things, and the Thames river taxis, the lovely vessels which ply up and down, are by far the most civilised way to do it. You can have iron brew, chocolate cake, and all sorts of things served from the little cafe while sitting there with a nice river view as you cruise along. Definitely the best way to do it from central London. Now, this is another character who's involved in it, and I can't find a decent picture of Sir John Knox-Launceford, and so I've done this. Before I talk about him, this person, he was involved in development of naval education. In 1915, the Orion-class dreadnought HMS Conqueror was actually dispatched to the Thames Estuary to provide a suitable platform for them to be buried at sea from. That's how important it was to the Navy. Now, I'd always thought that Conqueror was only there because she'd been being refitted and was just happening to be passing by and they just grabbed her. But when I looked up the details of her refit schedule, etc., it didn't add up. And no, she seems to have been actively sent, actively arranged. Now, John Knox Lawton, you might be going, well, hang on, Alex, have you mentioned the Lawton before? Well, yes, because I did my PhD. My first supervisor, my senior supervisor, first supervisor it's called in UK academic circles, is a guy called Professor Andrew Lambert, who is a professorship as it comes with a chair. It's a chair of Naval History and War Studies Department. And technically, it's called the Lawton Chair of Naval History. And it's technically called the Lawton Department, the Naval History Department at King's College London in the War Studies Department. And there you go. It's named for Sir John Knox Lawton, who is, how do I put this politely? He starts off as an engineer. He starts off teaching mathematics and science. And he starts off teaching, as a civilian shipboard instructor, teaching these things to the crew. And as said, that was something you had to have on the ships, as you were trying to prove, especially considering the quality of national education, for not just the midshipmen, but also for a lot of the sailors and the junior NCOs and etc. coming up. You had to have some form of education aboard the ship, someone to do some teaching. And when he finished his days at sea, and he joined there in 1852, and he got 1866, after he'd been 14 years at sea, he had joined the Royal Navy College at Portsmouth, which I talked about. And when that college was closed up and is moved to form the basis of the college at Greenwich, in 1873, 21 years after he graduated from Cambridge, well, he goes to Greenwich. And it becomes actually its head of meteorology and marine surveying departments. But as the 1870s go on, he starts teaching more and more history because it's needed. And he starts with, eventually does a presentation at Uruzi at the Royal United Service Institute in 1874, which he gives a lecture all about how it's important and necessary to analyse historical events rather than really go with a chronological survey. To actually analyse them, their whys, their wheres, their hows, their whos, their whats. All the information has to be analysed about it to properly learn the information from them. Just knowing when they happen doesn't tell you this. And well, he starts off to start building this course, and he is in many ways the friend and sponsor of people like Mahan, Corbett, and Herbert Richmond. In fact, Mahan, who some describe as a disciple, but others describe as a bit of not a sort of a mentee of Lawton's, wrote of him that he probably knows more naval history than any English-speaking man living. In 1885, after he'd served with the Navy, teaching the Navy, for 33 years, he leaves them to take a position as Professor of Modern History at King's College London. And whilst in that post, he uses his previous contact, the Admiralty, to get access to their archives, to establish the historic tradition of doing archival research on Admiralty documents. And then he goes on to found, in 1893, with the help of Admiral Cyprian Bridge, the Naval Records Society. and he acts as its first secretary. And that society still produces all these books and all these great things which I tend to produce at various points, like this, of the Mediterranean Fleet, their papers, 1930 to 1939. And it's the Navy Records Society. They produce these documents. They go to the archives and compile these documents and bring them together. And you have a wonderful book of primary sources. First-class primary sources. And they're really, really useful. And that was founded by John Knox Lawton with Admiral Scythian Bridge. Now, his histories, his work have, to an extent, been forgotten because he never produced a major book. I cannot go to him and go, well, here's his equivalent to Mahan or equivalent to Corbett. I can't do that. I can't produce a book like I can produce for Herbert Richmond, James Cable, and all the other naval theorists. In some regards, he's like, therefore, the theorists of steel, which I like to talk about, who are some of the Third Sea Lords, who you understand their theories of naval warfare by the ships they produce. With Knox Lawton, what he was producing, with what he was bringing together, it was about the minds he was inoculating. That's where we see his theories, what they come out and what they believe. Now, I would add that there are some great books about him. There is Prof. Andrew Lambert produced a work called The Foundation of Naval History by John Knox Lawton, the Royal Navy and Historical Profession. And there's also work by Donald Mackenzie Sherman called The Education of the Navy, Development of British Naval Strategic Thought, 1867 to 1914. But, and I will add this an important thing, those are both, as good as they are, as great as they are, interpretations of him by others looking in. A work from him, a seminal work from him that brings all his ideas together, doesn't exist. There's no collected speeches. Which is sad. It is really sad. But it's worthwhile looking up those books, and it's worthwhile thinking through some of his responses. You can find some of his work in things like the papers of Lord Charles Barham, of his papers. To an extent, the way they're compiled includes stuff from him, and that's where you find it. Mostly, it's in how the papers have been compiled. I think there's also some of the manuscripts relating to Lord Nelson, Admiral Lord Nelson, that were also created. Also have editations and brief notes from Knox Lawton in them. It's basically, you find bits and pieces of him everywhere. But, and I will say this, I would again point out how to judge his worth. In 1915, World War I is raging. The Grand Fleet's demand is at its highest. Orion-class dreadnought is a 13.5-inch battleship, a super dreadnought. I know that we often incorporate the super dreadnoughts with the Queen Elizabeth class, but remember, the Orions were first group to be called the super dreadnoughts because they had jumped up to 13.5-inch guns rather than 12-inch guns. The first ones to make that big leap. One of these ships, not that old, is made available. Even if it had been just passing through because it was being refitted, it still takes a day or so out of its time to do this, all the ceremony, all the duties, to lay him to rest in the Thames. But the fact that, as far as I can see, from the timings and things I've been able to access, it is pretty much especially sent to do this. That shows how much he mattered to the Navy. Maybe not to anyone else, but the Navy knew his worth. The Navy knew his value. not everyone who gets to be buried from a ship at sea. And it's certainly not everyone who gets a battleship. With that being said, Shameless Book Plug time. Now, Shameless Book Plug is always a fun point for me in a video because it allows me to go, thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you for helping the channel grow. Thank you for doing all those things you do because it really does matter. And thank you for the people who bought my book. There are more coming. There are more coming. It will come soon. Hopefully, I keep saying the end of March as a late birthday present to myself. That is my aim. That is what I will achieve. Hopefully. At this rate, might skip into early April, but it's going to be something along those lines. And to be honest, what I need to do is to get an actual writing editing day to actually be a whole day of writing editing. But as anyone who's moved into a house will not tell you, so I'm sure all of you know, I keep finding presents left to me by the previous owners. Or maybe the house's age. And when I say previous owners, it doesn't necessarily mean the immediate previous to us, but previous owners. There have been all sorts of things I've fixed. Thank goodness we did go with the Cat 7 cable. We have now found a whole series of extra electrical cables which were theoretically live and theoretically went nowhere, which ran in the walls and had to have them dealt with. And yeah, so this cable, which is shielded and protected and various other things, as well as being far too fast for the actual internet we get, is really a lifesaver. But anyway, now what we're going to do is we're going to go through various admirals who are presidents of the Greenwich Naval College and look at what the officers were, what the characteristics were the Royal Navy was hoping that their cadets, their trainees, their sub-lieutenants would pick up to take onwards with their careers. And starting off with Rear, later on Vice Admiral Astley Cooper Key, is a pretty good one to pick. Now, Astley Cooper Key is... what can I say about him? He was present at the bombardment of Sveaborg in August 1855 as part of the Crimean War. He takes part in the Anglo-French blockade of the Rio de la Plata. He had been part of the Second Opium War. He would go on to serve as first naval lord eventually in his career after having been commander of the North American West Indies Station. He would command Sans Pareil amphibian, Bulldog, which was a paddle sloop. Amphibian, of course, was a steam frigate. And HMS Conflict, she'd been part of his force at various points. He had all sorts of experience in terms of commanding ships. Taking part at the Battle of Canton in 1857 as part of the Naval Brigade, and had served on the Royal Commission of Defence of the United Kingdom in August 1859. He is, though, first and foremost, a massive advocate for the reform of naval administration and education. And as well as being a member of the Royal Society, etc., and all sorts of duties he'd done, he is the person who proposes, argues for, and eventually is made the president-designate of the Royal Naval College, Greenwich. He then gets to establish it the following year. So he has a full year to set it up. He goes to what was then the old hospital grounds in Greenwich and goes, right then, he's got a year to turn this into a naval college. And he does. His main philosophy about leadership was that you had to know what you were doing, you had to know who you were commanding, and you had to inspire them. He was not necessarily the most verbose, or even perhaps the most literally eloquent of naval officers, but he was a very capable one, and a very good at the politics of the naval service. He was not really a strategist. He was a practitioner and a bit of a politician. When he was in charge of the Navy, he would keep it within budgets and still get the 6 Admiral-class battleships, which were their era's equivalent of the F-22, as I've talked about it. Basically, the frigate around and find out ships. You frigate it around enough, now you're going to find out an admiral's arrived. It's an interesting piece of history to wander through those various vessels, and what they do and how they're used. So what he's trying to stress when he's training officers is not necessarily strategy, which is why, as it starts up, Knox Lawton doesn't have a post as a historian. He has a post, as I've talked about, as a scientist, as a marine surveyor, and in charge of that. He is very much about giving the Royal Navy more capable practitioners of the management of ships and the running of ships than he is necessarily about the commanding of ships. But there again, when we consider when he's starting this, in 1872, 1873, it sort of makes sense. It sort of makes sense. He's a good officer, though. He is a good officer. Then we have Vice Admiral, later Admiral William Luard. And Luard is, what can I say about him? He's interesting because he is a Huguenot. His family had been Protestant Huguenot merchants who'd fled to England from Caen in the 17th century. And they held on to a lot of their history, to a lot of their relationships. And one of the interesting things, of course, he does actually marry within the French Huguenot, families and extended families. He marries a lady called Charlotte de Caen. Now, his experience included serving as the captain in charge of HMS Formidable, HMS Conqueror. But it's as president of the Royal Naval College, 1882 to 1885, he has a real fun time. He is a great officer for personal gallantry, for personal strength, for personal leadership and personal examples. His career, his service, his experience, his activities of dispersing pirates at Chiapu as part of the Burmese War, all these things make him very much an officer, I would argue, more of the age of sail. Except there's one thing about him. There is one thing about him that's different, that probably pushes him to be a man of his time. That he really does believe you also need to have a fine technical knowledge. And he loves history. It's one of the interesting things, you put a Huguenot who's held onto his Huguenot roots and his traditional service in the Royal Navy in charge of this, he is coming in with a sense of history already. And as such, with a sense of history, when he has people like Knox Lawton asking for support, asking for aid, asking to allow them to teach history, he's not going to turn them down. When he feels that the others around him need to learn their history, he's a great choice. And again, sort of reflects the changes between these two, because over 10 years, the Royal Navy's moved from, this is purely about technical knowledge, to, we need a sense of history. You've got a technician who has a huge amount of technical experience and knowledge, but is no strategist, to someone who probably isn't still not a strategist, but is certainly a historian, and certainly believes in passing on the lessons of the past, and learning from them, and growing with them. And that leads us then quite neatly through to the next transition, which is Admiral Frederic Fisher. Yes, Jackie's younger brother. And this one's a real doozy. Now, the really interesting thing is Frederic Fisher is not his brother, and they have an interesting relationship as they were separated quite young. And also, the fact is, he is president of the Naval College the years that Jackie Fisher is absent from being First Sea Lord. Because Fisher finishes being First Sea Lord 1910, 1911-ish, and returned in 1914, and is in there for at some point in 1915, and Frederic Fisher is president 1911 to 1914. Now, here's the thing. When you look at his experience, you might go, well, hang on, Frederic, you've not got that much experience. You've served in command of some battleships, you've served in command of some cruisers, you have had a little bit of experience here, a little bit of experience there, you've been Admiral Superintendent of the Naval Reserves, you've done a few duties in Malta Dockyard and all sorts of things. But, supported the Admiral Superintendent of Reserves, etc. But realistically, what knowledge do you have? What skills do you have to pass on? You haven't fought any great battles. You haven't got any great victories. Well, he's a good, solid officer. But also, he's quite a balanced officer. He does both enjoy doing a bit of reading history, and he enjoys the service specialties. He has a technical skill. He has an administrative skill. He has a love for history and a love for science. In many regards, in the run-up to World War One, this is about producing a navy which focuses in on what you need for your officers, and they need to be all-rounders. If you're going to rapidly expand a service, you need as many of your officers, especially sub-lieutenants coming in, who are going to be the ones who are going to experience the most rapid promotion in any wartime, because they're going to be lieutenants with sub-lieutenants underneath them looking to their command, and they're going to be, maybe as lieutenants, they're going to be assuming command of certain things, etc. They are going to need to be the most well-rounded officers you can get. And for that, as an example, you want a well-rounded officer who not necessarily is a specialist in really anything, but is well-rounded enough to be able to recognize the specialisms and help guide the students to them. And you might think, well, what does the president really do? The president's the headmaster, the principal. They set the tone of the university. They sometimes do some teaching. Some did more teaching than others. Some liked to be more active in lectures. Some were more active wandering around talking than others. Some were less involved. But the Royal Navy tended to pick officers who were going to be the type to go and be involved, to go and find a way to communicate. You see, there is a difference between being president of the Naval College than being captain of a ship. You are not there as their commander, although you are their commander. You are there, most importantly, as their educator, as their mentor, as their living example of what they should be. Frederic Fisher in this role is a very interesting one, because in the run-up to World War One, those 3 years where you are producing all those junior officers who are going to go through and going to be critical in the war's time, but, think about it, most of the officers who are running most destroyers in World War One and etc. are lieutenants, lieutenant commanders. Many of them, in fact a huge number of them, went through Greenwich in this period. And it's Fisher, Frederic Fisher, who's in charge of training them. And this is the point. So far, we've had officers who've been taking us from one side of the spectrum to the other side, from the science to the humanities, etc. All these things. This is now, it's reached the point of, we don't need to correct, we need to maintain. You are officers who are going to need a range of skills. one of the interesting things was that comes up quite a lot with science, with the whole idea of STEM versus humanities, etc. And I find it an artificial thing to try and split them off too much. It makes sense from a teaching specialism perspective. It doesn't, and a core structure perspective. It doesn't make sense from a knowledge perspective. And the point is this: when you're seeking a solution to an engineering problem, how you implement it, how you organize the people, how you approach it in terms of management, that is a humanities problem. Leadership is about fusion of the two. The ideas and the implementation. Leadership as a naval officer, there is no point having great technical skill if you can't execute it with the people you have available to you. You can't treat humans like they're robots. They are too squidgy and organic. They don't go in enough straight lines. That's the humanities for you. And this is about producing the well-rounded officers. And this then brings us to Rear Admiral Herbert Richmond, who is President 1922 to 3, and is probably, how do I put this politely, the most academic naval officer you will meet in this period. The man literally goes off and writes papers and books for the Naval Records Society, the Cambridge University Press. He has critical duties all around the world, but the fact is, he's appointed as the V.R. Harmsworth Professor of Imperial Naval History at the University of Cambridge. He serves in that 1934 to 36. You don't get that for not being very, very academic. Now, I have to admit, these days that post seems to have changed far more to imperial and colonial history than naval history, but, you know, these things happen. You look through the history of the people who've held it and the roles they've had, and yes, it's got far more imperial than naval. But these things, again, they tend to self-correct. And with Richmond, again, it's an approach which is, to an extent, like Rear Admiral May. They've put in one of their most cerebral officers. But he is someone who's taken the science and the engineering and those skills, which he has had. He did develop them. You don't get to be a hydrographic service officer, a torpedo officer, a gunnery officer, all the skills you have, and he has, and then serve as an assistant to Jackie Fisher while he was First Sea Lord, and various other posts, and Assistant Director of Ordnance, without being a very good technical officer, without being very good at the technical science. But the thing is, working with Julian Corbett, working with Lawton, that made him start researching and made him become a bit of a historian. And by the time you get to 1922, and remember, he retires from naval service in 1931, by the time you get to 1922, he is already a published author. He's already an academic. He produced the private papers of Second Earl Spencer George, who'd been First Lord of the Admiralty, 1794 to 1801. 2 volumes. He does that in 1914, the year World War I begins. Prior to that, he'd done papers relating to the loss of Majorca in 1756. That was published in 1913. He does a lot of very interesting work. So you can find Statesman and Sea Power from the Ford Lectures in 1946, and The Navy as Instrument of Policy, 1558 to 1727, which was published in 1953. My personal favourite, because I feel at a certain point he goes almost too academic, and he turns almost absurd on that level, is Economy and Naval Security. A plea for the examination of the problem of the reduction in the cost of naval armaments on the lines of strategy and policy, published by Ernest Benn Limited in 1931. It's a good work to read. It is an interesting work to read. And at the same point, he is being used the whole way through this. While we're talking 1922 to 23, but also further on, as a sounding board by the Royal Navy. They literally send their war plans to him for him to critique, and he takes them apart. And sometimes I agree with his analysis, sometimes I don't. Honestly, he is a bit too focused on cruisers, believe it or not, in the face of other weapons of war by the late 1930s. You can understand where it's come from, considering his service history and what he loves, but aircraft carriers, battleships, all these things, he sees their value. But I would say that's because by the time you've got him talking in 1935, 36, he realistically is going down a path towards shaping conflict, conflict management, and deterrence more than necessarily fighting wars. How to deter them, how to be present. Also, he's making the case so strongly, I'd argue, for cruisers as well in that period, because there have been so many compromises made to cruiser numbers. It's kind of like the Mahan-Corbett duality, where people go, they completely disagree, and you go, no, they don't. It's just the first chapters and the framing. One's framed for the British audience, one's framed for the American audience. One, you can just the Navy is justified. You need to justify with their funding in peacetime. The other is you need to justify the existence of a navy at all. That makes for a very different conversation you're going to have with your audience, a very different approach in analysis and discussion. But yes, by the time we got to Richmond, we've got to a very different naval officer than we had historically. And then we have Ragnar Colvin. Now, Colvin is the guy who's chief of the Australian Naval Staff 1937 to 1941. He moves to that after having been president of the Royal Navy College in Greenwich. He literally goes from being in charge of training the Navy's future generations to being in charge, I would argue, of not just creating the growing Australian Navy, but also educating the Australian political class at the time in what they need to invest in, how they can best survive, how they can sustain themselves. Now, he'd served as an assistant director of plans, he'd served as all sorts of duties in terms of the Royal Navy, in terms of the Admiralty, and he'd had experience in World War One as, part HMS Hibernia and HMS Revenge. In fact, he ended up getting command of HMS Revenge 1924 to 25 and gets the 2nd Battle Squadron not long after that. He is a really experienced, really capable officer for the Royal Navy. He's also a very good all-rounder again. And what I would say is he's a bit of reaction to who went before him. I would argue that the officers, especially in the run from Richmond, have probably seen them more as educators, self-educators in many ways, than naval officers in the role. Colvin this is about educating naval officers. I'm a naval officer who educates other naval officers to be naval officers. And it's really interesting how he approaches it, how he develops it. He uses a lot of his experience. One of the things he does is a lot of discussions about command decisions. He seems to promote it as a thing. So questioning how do you approach this situation? How do you approach this scenario? How do you deal with this? How do you deal with that? These are critical things he works with. He's a good officer, and he's a capable one who really does help the Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy out. I mean, again, he's one of those officers who you cannot put to one side in many regards. What I would also say is, as President of Naval War College, he really pushes for the lessons to work together, for cooperation between the staff, for the course as a whole to work, and for different parts to play with it. And he really is also one of the officers who really does push the Royal Navy War College. And it's interesting to note that in this period, 34 to 37, this is when the third Sea Lord at the time, Admiral Henderson, is really using the War College quite a lot to back up a lot of his plans, a lot of his thought processes. And their papers which are coming out are, in many ways, Colvin is again looking down over them and is guiding and is involved in it. It's interesting to think about this place as being both combination fusion of bringing together all different facets of naval life, educational facility for growing naval officers, and also think tank in some regards. It is a true university. It's a true ideal of what a university should be. It's really approaching it, and it's under Colvin. It really, to my mind, reaches almost the peak of it. Then we have Augustus Agar, who's a Commodore. Now, he is, how do I put this politely, a destroyer, sloop, light cruiser commander. Those are the vessels he'd really focused on. And he'd actually been at Greenwich from Royal Navy College at Greenwich in 1939, serving as captain, which was usually the role underneath president. Now, the thing is, he returned to Greenwich, and then he was dispatched to command Admiral in 1939 because war was coming, and frankly, Augustus Agar is the sort of officer you want out there fighting. He is a career destroyer, small ship man. He's done things in coastal motor torpedo boats which, frankly, no one wants to go near. No one. He'd actually received his Victoria Cross for sinking a Soviet cruiser during the Russian Civil War after World War One. And, well, he's nuts. He really is. If you are thinking of, I'm going to turn the current officers in service at junior lieutenants into probably the most absolutely extreme of destroyermen, Agar's who you pick. I mean, short of finding Philip Vian and cloning him, I can't think of a better method of actually producing such officers. He is shamelessly aggressive. He is shamelessly hard-working at his job. The fact is, though, he also is one of those interesting officers who is both shamelessly aggressive and professional, but also a younger brother of Trinity House. He works with them and their societies. He's vice president of Sailors' Home and Red Ensign Club after World War II. He publishes books, Footprints in the Sea and Showing the Flag, and the Baltic episode. Showing the Flag is particularly an interesting one to me. Baltic episode is useful. That's a useful piece of history. But Showing the Flag, published in 1962, that's a read and a half. And he had stories to inspire those young officers. Yes, he was never going to reach admiral rank. He divorced, and in this period, that made it very difficult for you to achieve flag rank. But the Royal Navy had got round it by making him a Commodore and putting him in charge. He's good enough you want to put him in charge, especially in wartime, to inspire them. This, giving example of experience, and this is his time during the war. When he set sail with HMS Emerald to go to Halifax, Nova Scotia, carrying £2 million in gold bars. This is part of Operation Fish. He sailed through some of the roughest seas he felt he'd ever sailed through in his life. By the time he arrives in Halifax, they've lost their boats, they've lost their rafts, they've lost depth charges, wires broken, shackles, and her fairy Sea Fox had all gone. All gone. She also didn't have any gloves, woolen scarves, sea boot stockings, anything for the crew. And it's Agar which sorts it out for them. It's Agar which makes sure that this crew has everything they need. Yes, there are naval stockers. Yes, there's the Red Cross, Canadian Red Cross, ready to provide these materials. All these things are doing. But he goes and makes sure it's done personally. And this is another big thing about leadership here. He's a living example of, okay, sometimes things are important enough that whilst there are the systems in place to do it, and these things should work, and everything should happen, sometimes, in order to make sure it happens, you go and stick your hand on that lever yourself. You go do that, and go, have you done this? And he's a good example of this. He is shamelessly a wartime officer, I would argue, in many ways, in terms of his capabilities. And he is someone who also, in between, his stints at Greenwich, served as Chief of Staff for the Rear Admiral commanding coastal forces, inspiring them. He is this kind of aggressive officer, going around doing the duties where he's needed, all over the world. It gets everywhere. The most telling thing is that his last command is HMS Dorsetshire, and she is sunk by the Japanese. He manages to get his crew rescued, but he also is injured by shrapnel. And it's the shrapnel wound which really puts an end to his seagoing career. And it's one of the reasons he ends up back at president, and back as president of Greenwich Naval College. He is one of those absolutely wonderful characters, and you couldn't have had a better fit for that role at this time. You can also find his coastal motorboat, number 4, still on display in Duxford Museum, in the Imperial War Museum, Duxford. His VC is in the Imperial War Museum, London. My view is those two things should be united, but I don't think that will ever happen, because the VCs are not being let anywhere out of the sight of the space that stores them. They are just too valuable, but in which case I think CMB4 should be brought to the IWM London, but I doubt I'll win that argument as well, because she takes up a bit of space. He was a good commanding officer, and he did get married again, and he managed to also serve a little bit of time looking after the completion of HMS Unicorn, after he'd been injured with the loss of the Dorsetshire. So he really had an impact on World War II at a captain Commodore level, and it's kind of interesting because Augustus Agar is not one of the people who's really talked about in relation to his World War II service. He should be. He was a good officer. He was an officer who was probably on his way out prior to the war because of his divorce, because that meant that he wasn't suitable for higher flag rank. You remember, we're talking about a nation where the king had been forced to step down because he wanted to marry a divorcee. It's unsurprising that a mere naval officer is not going to get to flag rank because of it. And Commodore is not a substantive rank, remember, in this period. Commodore is something which is given to captains, but when they retire, they revert to captain. It's kind of like the US Navy and Rear Admiral, where no matter what rank of Admiral you are, you're still just a Rear Admiral. Well, with Commodores, they're still only captains in this period. And then we have Admiral Sir Eric James Patrick Brind, who takes over 1946 to 8. Now, why did I want to put him there? Brind is the man who, for me, epitomizes the cruiser officer. He is the man in charge of HMS Birmingham when she does what she needs to do. He is the officer who takes HMS Birmingham into, and this is always the fun thing, into Tsingtao to face off with the Japanese in January 1939, where you've got 3 Ashigara class pointing their guns at him and him pointing his guns at them. All to get out the SS St. Vincent de Paul. It's an interesting incident, and one of the fun things about when you're trying to do all the studies of that is you start to realize just how much calculation is going on, how much control is going on, how much performative naval diplomacy and conflict management is going on. Any hesitation on either side could be read as weakness, but any overstepping on either side could lead to war. It is such a carefully choreographed scenario, yet there is no person choreographing it, no one voice directing it or overseeing it. It's each side having to improv. For a Royal Navy approaching the Cold War world, post-World War II, its changing role in the world, who better to pick as the commander of the Greenwich Naval, as the president and commanding officer of the Naval College? Who better to inspire young officers to what you need them to be? If you think about the events of the Cold War and the scenarios they often find themselves facing, this is the master. This is the person they need to be learning from. And it's fortuitous, maybe, but maybe also it's good selection going on by the senior officers. Looking around the number and going, Brend, yeah? Go make them you. Go give them yourself as an example. The qualities, the self-control, the perception. You know, the Tsingtao incident is always interesting, and there are videos about this on my channel for me, because so many things could have gone wrong for both sides in that. If the British had shown weakness, then war could have started out earlier, because the Japanese could have interpreted any sign of weakness as us withdrawing. And for people who say, well, no, they wouldn't have done because of the rest of the things the British were doing in the world at the time in January 1939, remember, the Argentines convinced themselves that the British won't fight over the Falkland Islands based on an Arctic patrol ship possibly not being renewed. Now, the thing is, the question should have been, not whether or not the British are prepared to fight, but do they actually have the capability to fight? And honestly, there are other systems you should have been hoping to get rid of with that, in which case you could argue current governments have been far more successful for them, but we'll leave that to one side. That's a completely different matter. The point is, naval diplomacy, conflict management, the signalling you send is an important part of how you shape the Cold War. It's an important part of how you shape naval relations. The problem for the Royal Navy in 1939, 40, 41 was the assets which they used to shape and, in many ways, adjust the perception of the Japanese, so the relative strength of the British, the relative capabilities of the British, were being withdrawn to cover for assets in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, where they were needed by the crisis and crucible of war, but where they were not available to carry out their duties of conflict management. And it's a skill. It's a skill to know what do you do, because let's be honest, if you're in that scenario, pointing your guns at the other ships, that could be read as a futile gesture. And honestly, if you just pointed the guns at the ships, it probably would have been. But the guns were focused on their bridges, on where their officers were. It's within harbour. The Rangers are so close, they could pierce their armour belt, they could smash them. And that's the sensible naval doctrine to do. That's what you should probably do, but it's not what happened. The guns weren't focused that way. Why? Is the question Austin is asked, and it's because of this. It's making the point that the battle's going to be personal. Honestly, the damage done by the 6-inch shells hitting at that angle, this is going to wreck their superstructure and it's going to wreck those ships. And having the 4th turret looking off at wherever the headquarters was ashore, that's just performative. But it's necessary performance. We're going to sink. We're going to get destroyed in this battle. So are you. Doesn't matter. But we're going to make sure you're dead. You personally. The people who give the orders. See, if we're just targeting the ships, we're just going through the motions. It's not personal. It's entirely professional. This is adding a personal level of culpability to it, a personal level of resolution to it, which adds the necessary issues which put it over the top and allow, I think, for it to be as peacefully resolved as it is. It's later on that HMS Liverpool will do another action in the Asamimaru incident, where they literally stop a Japanese cruise liner, the pride of their fleet, practically just outside Tokyo Harbor. It's what the Royal Navy do, and that takes place in January 1940. There isn't an event in January 1941, but it's almost as if these events turn up almost every 12 months for the Royal Navy to remind the Japanese Navy, yeah, you might have more numbers than us in this area, but that doesn't mean we're afraid of you. We are almost obscenely confident. And that's what gives the Japanese pause for thought. Get it right, get it wrong, either too weak. Judge it the wrong way and get it to make yourself look weak. They might attack you. Go too strong, go too hard. You look hubristic and they might attack you. They might think you're covering up. You have to judge it right. And in a nicest way, what Bryn pulled worked at Tsingtao, but in another incident, it might have been the exact wrong play. But the thing is, you need officers to make those judgments. That's where the humanities and the STEM work together. The science, technology, all those things. You put those skills together. What can you do? And what should you do? Those are the two different questions. I'd also argue that the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics question is the what can I do? The humanities question is what should I do? And you need to answer both when you're doing that job. You need to answer both when you're doing conflict management, when you're doing this role. With that being said, and if I'm not mistaken, Brenda's where we finish. Now, I've given you a talk through the various presidents of the Naval War College and the Naval College, and some of the people in charge of the Naval War College as well. Although, as said, later on, basically post World War I, the two roles, they're sometimes separate, sometimes are definitely not separate, and sometimes it's all very interesting. It's very Royal Navy, is what I'll say. It's very, very Royal Navy. But the thing is, I want you to think about the officers I talked about today, and I want to ask you this question. Which of these officers, if you were running a naval college today, for these officers, if you were running a Royal Navy Staff College, which of them would you want back to command the Staff College? Who would you want back as president today? That being said, what have we got coming up? Well, next week we have the Paulette Affair and Diplomatic Leadership of Admiral Richard Thomas. Now, the thing is, I'm off Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday this week. And I had recorded a version of that, so that would be fully done and recorded for when I go back. I now don't like it, so I'm going to hopefully re-record it on Monday next week. And so that will hopefully be the version you'll see. We'll see. But yeah, the Paul affair and the diplomatic leadership of Admiral Richard Thomas. I think it's going to be a fun one for you. It's going to be a bit different. And thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and please like, share, and subscribe if you like the videos. Take care.